Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems for its U.S. Elections Program 2020. You are currently attending the third panel event of this program, Voting by Mail in the U.S., Who Counts? I look forward to a lively conversation with some of our country's top experts on voting processes and voter participation. Before getting started, I do want to note that IFES is a 501c3 organization funded in part by the U.S. government, with a bipartisan board of directors and a nonpartisan organizational identity. We provide apolitical democracy and elections assistance that I know many members of our audience are quite familiar with. This work is made possible by the generous support of the American people through the United States Agency for International Development and other supporters. The content associated with this event does not necessarily reflect the views of USAID or our sponsors, nor do the opinions expressed by our panelists reflect the views or opinions of IFES. My name is Bailey Dinman, and I am a research coordinator within IFES's Center for Applied Research and Learning. Our discussion today will be centered on the trends and practical considerations for mail-in voting. In response to the coronavirus pandemic and concerns over virus transmission, this year, at least 3/4 of American voters were eligible to receive mail-in ballots ahead of the November general election, the most in U.S. history. And while state laws vary on how voters can cast their ballots, all states and territories allow at least some mail voting. And this is a rapid and seismic shift in how Americans will vote and has required drastic adjustments by local election authorities charged with organizing a challenging voting and counting process under strict and changing deadlines. Though many of these changes have been enacted temporarily on an emergency basis, these expansions may impact the ways in which elections are run in the US well into the future. Today, I am so excited to be joined by 4 elections experts for this discussion. David Becker is the executive director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, which helps states maintain accurate and complete voter lists, as well as secures election technology infrastructure. Dr. Manuel Wally is a legal expert with over 15 years of professional experience in civil society, democratic accountability, and elections. Manuel is also the author of IFES's recent publication on postal voting, which can be accessed through the link in the chat box. And finally, Secretary Kim Wyman is Washington's 15th Secretary of State, who is currently serving in her second term. And she has helped to oversee and implement the introduction of universal mail-in voting in Washington state. Welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to the audience's participation and welcome you to ask questions in the Zoom chat function, which we will be monitoring throughout the session. So to start our conversation, I am going to ask us to think back to life before the pandemic. So while limited voting by mail in the US dates back to the Civil War, and by 1924, 45 of the then 48 states had adopted absentee voting to some extent, most Americans have continued to traditionally vote in their neighborhood polling places. But beginning in the 1980s, some states, such as Washington, have eased rules on issuing absentee ballots, allowed voters to cast ballots in person before Election Day, or begun mailing ballots to all eligible voters. So Secretary Wyman, we'll start with you. What were some of the trends that we saw in mail-in voting ahead of this election cycle?
Well, here in Washington, we've been voting by mail as a state since 2011, but we really started that transition back in the really early 1990s. And so we've had a long, pretty steep, but long ramp up to vote by mail. And what we've really seen is, one, our voters really like it, and we do see good participation, but typically we see anywhere from 50 to 60% of our ballots coming in the week of election. And this in Washington state, we have a postmark requirement. So we do get ballots in weeks after the election, which is kind of funny because that's becoming really a hot topic. It appears in the courts, but we're seeing a new trend in this election, and we already have over 50% of our ballots in right now. So who knows? It's a COVID year. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Secretary Wyman. And as you alluded, COVID-19 began spreading throughout the U.S. in late February, early March, the middle of the primary election season. And as a result, 16 states and 2 territories ultimately pushed back their presidential primaries or switched to voting by mail with extended deadlines. So David, I'll turn to you now. How did elections officials adapt in the months since leading up to the November election?
Well, there were a lot of difficulties during the primary season, of course, as everyone was adapting to a new reality due to the pandemic. And we have to remember that the pandemic hit us and hit elections, especially as we were already dealing with foreign interference issues and also dealing with a lack of resources in many ways. So primaries were a little bit rough, especially the primaries that hit right in April and May. But there were a ton of lessons learned from that. And what we're seeing right now is those lessons were really put into play by election officials well to offer more options for voters and educate them about those options, voting by mail, voting early in person, finding large polling places, for instance, where they could maintain social distancing very easily and could accommodate a lot of voters. And that is really paying off. We are seeing, it's really not even fair to say record early voting turnout in the United States. We've seen nearly 80 million people already vote in this election with 5 days to go. We've seen over 50 million mail ballots already returned in this election with 5 days to go. And these are the 5 days when we would expect the largest numbers of early voting and mail ballots being returned. So the response by election officials to inform and educate voters here in the United States, and also by the voters to really understand the challenges and to work hard and to respond in the way that they have been remarkable.
Thanks, David. Yeah, these are challenging and trying times for us all, but I agree. I think the innovation of election administrators and on the part of voters themselves will be something to remember and emulate in future election cycles. So now let's shift to the mechanics of it, how to actually run an election by mail. And I'll turn back to you, Secretary Wyman. So Washington State began this process last century and almost started voting almost entirely by mail in 2011. So what led to that decision? And what has your state's experience been with mail-in voting, especially as compared to other states who are really expanding the practice in this election cycle?
Well, as I said, we really started this ahead of the curve, I guess. Back in the early 1980s, we allowed seniors and people who were living with disabilities to be able to be what we called permanent absentee voter. And by 1993, our legislature allowed any voter to become a permanent absentee voter. And over the course of the next 5 years or so, we saw this tremendous ramp up of people choosing to be absentee voters for every election. And so we hit a point in 2004 when we had the closest governor's race in the country's history, where we realized we couldn't do both elections well. We couldn't do a full poll site election and a full vote by mail election because we had 60% of our voters getting an absentee ballot every election. So the next year, our legislature allowed us to opt in, if you will, at the county level as a vote by mail counties. And most counties of our 39 counties did move that year. We had 2 counties that it took a while longer. Our biggest county, King County, where Seattle is, took about 5 years to really ramp up because they needed to just build out the space and the capacity and the personnel to be able to deal with their volumes. And then our final county was mandated in 2011 by our legislature, and that was Pierce County, where Tacoma is. And that was because their voters were so adamantly against it. They didn't like it, so they were forced into it. But we've been vote by mail ever since and have really been able to prepare for this year.
Thank you, Secretary Wyman. And, Washington is leading the trend, but it is not unique in this regard. And countries all around the world, to varying degrees, also use postal voting for certain elections. Let's now hear from Robert Peden, the former Chief Electoral Officer of New Zealand, about how to cast a special vote in his country.
To make a special vote, you need to complete a statutory declaration that establishes your eligibility for that vote, that sets out the ground under the legislation that you're entitled to vote in some way other than going and voting in person at a polling place. So you complete that statutory declaration. That declaration needs to be witnessed. A wide range of people who can witness a statutory declaration. So that isn't a real barrier to somebody participating. You complete the declaration. When you're given your voting papers, you're provided with a envelope, a dual pocket envelope. Your statutory declaration goes into one pocket of that envelope. Your voting papers, after you've completed them, go into the other pocket of the envelope. That envelope then gets returned to the returning officer for your electorate. And before your vote is taken out of that envelope, it remains sealed in the envelope until the declaration has been taken out and verified by the returning office to ensure that you're on the roll and that you're eligible and that you qualify for a special vote.
Thanks, Robert, for that. And so now I'll turn to Manuel to hear about his research process and provide more of a comparative global perspective. So Manuel, how does our US system compare globally, especially in countries where there's one central election authority running elections and determining what vote by mail will look like?
Well, interestingly enough, while the United States clearly is in the avant-garde in introducing postal voting both as universal and as absentee voting, it is far from alone in the world in doing that in country. An important number of countries has always allowed voters overseas to cast ballots by mail to their embassies or even back to the home country. And by now, 46 countries also allow voters to cast votes in country by mail. To the extent that the US is practicing, a few countries really stand out. The first one I'd like to mention is Switzerland, which has a system akin to the one that Secretary Wyman described for Washington State. They send a ballot to every registered voter, and they've done so for about as long as Washington State, and they're doing it very, very successfully. It's interesting that also a continually growing number of voters don't return their ballots by mail, but do it through drop boxes. Other countries, as we've heard from CEO Robert Peden, New Zealand has introduced universal by mail voting for its referenda and for its local elections, in which also every registered voter receives a ballot by mail and casts it by mail, as does Australia for local elections and for a recent plebiscite. Countries in Europe have also expanded in-country voting by mail. Germany, for example, allows any registered voter to vote by mail without an excuse, as does the United Kingdom and Luxembourg. And in Germany, about 40% of votes are now cast by mail. That experience in Germany has allowed the state of Bavaria at the peak of the pandemic to run its local second round elections for mayors and city councils, to run that also by universal by mail system. It was at the end of March in 2020, so no polling stations were opened at all for security reasons, and turnout was solid and results were accepted by everybody. Austria, for example, has had 30% postal voting participation at its last parliamentary elections, and now saw that before the pandemic, and now saw that go up to 40% at the Vienna Municipal Council elections just last month. Practices that are different overseas, perhaps, than in the US, where the US could actually maybe learn a thing or two, is some frameworks overseas, the frameworks of South Korea, Luxembourg, and Austria, impose that ballots, live ballots, be dispatched to voters by registered mail rather than by regular mail, which guarantees that the voter actually signs off on the receipt of the ballot, which prevents stray ballots. It's quite an expensive undertaking. Bosnia requires the same for out-of-country voters when they return out-of-country ballots by mail. Now, this is a budget issue, and in order to do that, obviously, there needs to be substantial funds allocated to do that. What's interesting in Germany and Austria is that the Postal Service there guarantees that all street collection mailboxes are emptied the night before Election Day, and the Postal Service guarantees delivering all of these ballots cast by mail to be delivered to the election authorities by the night of Election Day. These postal services also charge a substantial premium for this service, but it obviates the controversy that's ongoing in the US right now in terms of deadlines for either ballot postmarking or ballot arrival, because the Postal Service makes that guarantee. Again, a costly undertaking that would have to be funded if implemented in the US.
Thank you, Manuel. And I see now that we are joined by our fifth speaker, Dr. Mindy Romero. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. Mindy is the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy based out of the University of Southern California. And her research focuses on political behavior and race and seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color. So Mindy, I'll throw the next question to you. In your opinion, what are some of the biggest advantages, disadvantages, and challenges in expanding a vote-by-mail system, particularly for voters themselves?
Sure, and we were working through some tech issues, so I'm happy to join all of you now. So advantages and disadvantages for voters. I think to this time right now that we're in terms of a pandemic has obviously added additional challenges and considerations like public health and safety. Generally speaking, if we're talking about a vote by mail, it's a positive. It gives it another option for voters to be able to cast their ballots, to be able to have their voice heard. There's also different reasons why people choose vote by mail, or sometimes I'd like to not even use the word choose, why they use vote by mail and why they vote in person. So for many groups, it's an absolute must to vote in person still. We want to make sure that that's understood, right? Needing language assistance at the polls, needing to use an accessible voting machine, a deep history in their community or in their family, to sense of wanting to be seen and heard, those sorts of things. But vote by mail is something that also adds convenience. Sometimes it's the only thing that's available to somebody who's working multiple jobs or doesn't have the convenience right with work or has family obligations or other reasons. And then certainly to be able to express yourself, right? As I think at least that's some of what we're seeing right now with these really early votes, particularly in a state like California, where I'm at, we're seeing so many people be able to vote as soon as they get that vote by mail ballot in and send it in, and have maybe even a sense of relief that they've participated in the process, but they know at least that vote is in and it's secure, and they don't have to worry if they dropped it off or they mailed it in, but it's in, and they don't necessarily have to worry about something happening on election day or at the polls that might prevent them from getting to the polls. So those are some advantages. And then, of course, right now, health advantages, right? No, and then of course, right now, health advantages, of course, in terms of expansion of vote by mail. So people don't have to choose between their health, potentially contracting COVID and voting. So.
Thanks, Mindy. And David, I'll turn to you with the same question. In your opinion, what do you think are the biggest advantages, disadvantages, and challenges in expanding a vote by mail system during this time, in particular from the election administration and legal side, to ensure that ballots are sent and counted correctly and timely?
Well, what we see is that states who do mail voting very well, states like Washington, of course, Oregon, Colorado, et cetera, they have evolved to that over a period of time. And they've really worked to educate their voters about how to do it, because there are mistakes people could make when they vote by mail if they're not familiar with how to do that. That could put their vote at risk. And that has yielded great successes in those states. It's a lot harder to ramp that up all of a sudden. And as Mindy kind of alluded to, mail voting is not for everybody. There are things you have to do on the outside of a mail ballot to demonstrate your eligibility, to demonstrate that it's a valid ballot cast, that would be done for you if you went to a polling place. If there were any problem with with your ability to vote and you went to a polling place, that could be resolved there. You could cast at a minimum a provisional ballot. If there were a problem with a mail ballot, of course, that would be resolved when the voter is no longer there, and that could lead to a problem with their ballot. I think states that see a lot of mail ballots, and particularly a quick ramp up to mail ballots, can also see a huge increase in provisional ballots, because what you'll see is people who've received a mail ballot showing up at the polls anyway and trying to vote in person. And actually, what we're seeing here is a great success of election administration, I think, in the United States, as we're seeing so many vote either by returning their mail ballot. As I mentioned, over 50 million have already been returned, well over 50% of those that have been sent out. And still, we've seen tens of millions of people who've also chosen to vote in person early. And I do want to stress that what election administrators have been able to do as they've learned how to deal with the pandemic and their resource challenges is they've been able to make it so that voters didn't have to make a choice between their health and their vote. People are voting safely in person. People are maintaining social distancing. There are masks at polling places for the workers and for voters. There are plexiglass shields. There's hand sanitizer. So there's a variety of things that are being done. This election is going to end up being a great success of election administration, I think, for Secretary Wyman and all of her colleagues around the United States.
Thank you, Dan.
The challenges I think that we should all just keep in mind is the voter education component, kind of tying it together. So for election officials and others working in the field, in any system, but particularly when you have a quick ramp up to vote by mail, there's a lot of voter education that needs to be done. So voters understand how to fill out that ballot, also how to understand why the change is being made, so hopefully you build trust, right, in the system, particularly now in this time as we see a lot of mistrust and misinformation around vote by mail, but just generally. And things like preventing your ballot from being rejected. Ballot rejection rates are very low in the United States, but ballots do get rejected a certain percentage every year, very small, but it adds up. And making sure voters not only feel comfortable and know how to fill out that ballot and get it in, but they get it in successfully so it's fully counted. And we do understand that there are differences across the United States in terms of who uses vote by mail. Different groups are more likely to, they're coming out starting at a different place. So some groups by race and ethnicity age are more likely to use vote by mail to begin with than other groups. And also when it comes to rejection rates, it's disproportionately distributed in terms of the likeliness of your ballot being rejected. And so getting to those groups, right, understanding those that have a higher rejection rate, comparatively speaking, conducting that outreach, making sure voters are comfortable and confident in the process, and they're not disproportionately impacted by a rejection or lack of information.
Thank you, Mindy. And Manuel, just want to turn to you. Do you have any other thoughts on the question?
Well, the basic difference between voting in a controlled environment, a polling station, and voting at home is that when voting in a polling station, the election administration can reconcile the number of ballots it avails to the polling station with the number of ballots that are cast and with the number of unused and spoiled ballots. And that's a zero-sum game. So it all pencils out in the end. In voting by mail, as David said at the beginning, 92 million ballots have been sent out. Over 50 million have now been returned, but 41 million mail ballots are still out there. And what the election administration does in postal voting is it delegates the chain of custody of the ballot to the postal service and also to the voter at home. The key measure to add accountability to this delegation of the chain of custody is really barcoding. And the United States has made a quantum leap between the primaries this year and the general election. In the primaries, only a handful of states have consistently applied barcodes to ballot envelopes, and now 41 states apparently do this statewide. The barcoding allows a number of things to do, and I think where there's still room for improvement is to unpack the number of these ballots that haven't returned yet or that might never return. A number of these ballots obviously were sent to people who ultimately decide to abstain, where, for example, a political party sent the application on behalf of the voter, and the voter receives the ballot and decides not to vote because they don't like either candidate. But then a number of ballots, may have not been deliverable to the voter, and they would then be returned to the election administration. So me personally, for integrity purposes, I would like to know how many of these ballots were actually undeliverable among those 41 million. How many of these ballots were recorded to be re-entered into the mail stream, that means cast by voters into a mailbox that are still in transit? How many of these ballots were sent to voters that have since voted in a early voting place? And that is very traceable now with electronic poll books that are synchronized with state voter databases, where the voter automatically gets marked off for having voted early. And that could be easily triangulated with the postal ballot that would have been sent to that voter. So we would be better able to quantify the number of 42 million ballots that are still out there and not returned. I think that would build a lot of trust, a lot of public trust in the institution of postal voting.
Bailey, could I just add a quick point?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, David.
To the point of the remaining ballots that haven't been cast yet, we should remember that there are several states, Washington, of course, is among them, that sends ballots to all active registered voters. And when you send ballots to all active registered voters, you don't expect 100% turnout. There are going to be a significant percentage of voters who don't vote in any election, regardless of whether it's by mail or in person. So California, New Jersey, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Nevada, and several other places are sending ballots out to everybody. That's a lot of ballots. And it would be entirely normal for tens of millions of those ballots not to be returned, just because in a presidential election, we might see 60+% of eligible voters, maybe 75% of registered voters participate. So we see a significant number of people not voting, and that's entirely normal.
Thank you all. And, you highlighted a variety of challenges: voter education, processing and counting, simply voters receiving ballots. So Secretary Wyman, I want to turn to you. How has Washington State addressed some of these challenges, and how have you adapted in the past few years?
Well, like I said, having a close governor's race really does change your whole perspective and outlook on how you conduct elections. So we took away 3 pretty important lessons that I've been trying to share with every one of my colleagues that will listen as often as possible. And the first thing is you absolutely have to start with your processes and your procedures and your control measures. You need to have those in place, and you need to make sure that everyone understands them and that you're applying them consistently across the state, which is kind of the second one. What we really found, and you always find, at least from my experience in a recount, is if it's a statewide recount, when the lawyers come in, and no offense to all of the lawyers on the call, but when the lawyers come in and start trying to pick apart the election, they're looking for inconsistencies. They're looking for, somewhere where there might be an equal protection issue, there might be disparate treatment. So, it's really important that you are being consistent across the state. So, for example, we have a voter intent manual, and this came really following Bush v. Gore in 2000. But what it is it's all of the creative ways our voters can mark a ballot. And it sounds really silly, but the thing we really notice with voters sitting at their kitchen table and voting is they do things that you just can't anticipate. No matter how clear your instructions, no matter how hard you try, they do things that you just don't expect. So we have rules around kind of most of the ballots. I'd say probably 90% of the ballots fall into a category that's in our voter intent manual. But what's important is every election worker who is doing that voter intent, looking at the ballot where the voter has signed or circled the name of the candidate rather than filling in the oval. How are you going to duplicate that? How are you going to adjudicate it? And having that consistency is really important. And then finally, really understanding your throughput. What we haven't really touched on at all, and what I'm probably most worried about for states that aren't used to high volumes, or really any, in some cases, any real absentee volume, is that they're going to get swamped in the days leading into the election. And I have that same concern for my 39 counties. Quite honestly, we're bringing up same-day registration this year for the first time in a presidential year, and it's unknown. We're anticipating 90% turnout, and I might be bragging a little there just for David Becker, but we're telling our counties to plan for 90% turnout. We already have over 50% back. In our primary election, we had right as COVID was starting to spike in February, and we had the first. I think you probably remember, we were the epicenter initially, and that was in the last 5 days of voting here in Washington State, and we were tracking to have 60% turnout in our presidential primary. And it dropped down by about 10 percentage points. So, there's a lot of things that can affect turnout, but I think that that's probably one of my global worries across the country is states that aren't used to having heavy volumes won't have the capacity and throughput, and it's going to take them longer than that 2 days, 3 days, 5 days that they have in statute. And we're just going to see more litigation over it.
Thank you all for your insights. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think a common thread that all of you mentioned was access, voting rights, and turnouts. And David, you keep citing, 50 million mail-in ballots have already been returned, and an unknown additional number cast by mail. And this surpasses previous turnout. The record was set just in the last presidential election. In many ways, in many states on paper, yes, it should be safer and easier to participate. But Mindy, as you alluded to, this has not been the case for all voters. So I want to pick up on that point a bit. So we see evidence of how these seemingly neutral rules, such as deadlines, witnesses, signature matches, can disproportionately impact young voters and voters of color. So a study of rejected mail ballots in the 2018 Florida election found that the rejection rate for vote by mail ballots for those ages 18 to 21 was 5.4%, compared to just 0.6% for those over 65. And this year in North Carolina, according to data from the U.S. Elections Project, Black voters' mail-in ballots have been rejected at a rate of almost 3 times those as white voters. And data is showing that this is happening in Florida as well, both key swing states in this election. Mindy, you suggested one explanation is voter education. There is a higher error rate for first-time voters. And Black voters have traditionally been more likely to vote in person due to decades of voter suppression and intimidation. But these statistics for some, have set off alarms about possible disenfranchisement. So I want to turn it to you, Mindy. What considerations must be made to ensure voting by mail is equitable and accessible, particularly for youth and communities of color?
Take myself off of mute. Clearly a very important question. So I did suggest voter error. Certainly that's a huge part of this, but we should say, of course, that there are, as you suggested, right, historical patterns and factors that go into why voters vote today, and that can impact their likelihood of possibly getting rejected. So that's important. So in terms of just simply putting the responsibility, or even, if you will, the blame on voters, I think we should be careful there. So the fact is, though, that we do have different likelihoods of rejection by race, ethnicity, age, and other statuses. I think it's important to understand that also the way we process ballots, so the rules behind the scenes, right, do also have an impact in terms of somebody's likelihood of getting their ballot rejected. So even in a state like California, there are differences across the state, or at least historically there have been, in terms of how ballots have been processed and in terms of thresholds for signature verification, for instance. So it's understanding where voters are coming from, certainly educating voters in the now, in the election that they're in, and helping them to avoid, and we should say the top 3 reasons typically for ballot rejection are the ballot coming in late, a no signature, or a bad or mismatched signature. That's very, very common. That does vary, though, by the way, across groups. So young people, typically, they're more likely to, if they're going to be rejected, it's because of being lateness, although it can be all 3. For older senior voters, it can be a bad signature. So it does vary across groups also, which is important for outreach and education. But also to understand that as we're evaluating our election laws and our election procedures, that we make sure as much as possible that the way the ballots are being processed and verified doesn't have a disproportionate impact, across geography. If you live in one county, you shouldn't have a different likelihood of getting your ballot rejected, all else being equal, versus another county, for instance. And I think we still have a ways to go in terms of understanding those impacts, certainly more research to understand that. But that's something to keep in mind, certainly. That is, I think, an important part of the conversation around ballot rejection and equity issues.
Thank you, Mindy. And as you said, despite being a convenient option for some voters, vote by mail is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. In fact, it is inaccessible to many voters with disabilities who rely on in-person accessibility features when voting to guarantee their right to a secure, private, and independent vote. So let's now hear from Michelle Bishop, who is the Voter Access and Engagement Manager at the National Disability Rights Network, to talk a bit more about this.
has kind of taken center stage in 2020. The problem with that we were grappling with back in March is that a lot of absentee and vote by mail systems are not accessible to people with disabilities. It's really an issue that's flown under the radar for a really long time. Because that's just not how the ADA works. You can't say our polling places are accessible, so our vote by mail isn't, or our polling places are inaccessible, so you can vote by mail. Really, if those options are available to non-disabled voters, they have to be accessible for all voters. If someone who doesn't have a disability can choose whether or not they're going to go to their polling place or vote by mail, a person with a disability has the same rights. And vote by mail and absentee, it's exactly what it sounds like. The traditional method of that is mailing you a piece of paper. And so you have to be able to handle that paper, read that paper, mark that paper by hand. And for so many eligible voters, that's just not a reality.
You mentioned some of the challenges. I think people often assume vote by mail is what people with disabilities want, but that's definitely not the case for everyone. And also many people with disabilities still do want to go vote in person, in their polling stations.
For sure. I love voting in person. I want my I voted sticker on election day.
Thanks, Michelle, for that. So I want to turn to you, Manuel. What considerations must be made to ensure voting by mail is accessible to voters with disabilities?
Well, first of all, we can't allow counties or states not to make polling places accessible by universal design just by saying we're doing postal voting. We don't need that. We don't need to make these polling places physically accessible. At the same time, voters with disabilities that impact their mobility and might not necessarily be a disability, but just somebody lacking transport, for example, postal voting can greatly facilitate voting access. Now, there are obviously disabilities that voting by mail does not address. For example, motoric disabilities, visual disabilities. So there are specific solutions that different states in the US, but also different countries across the world have developed. For example, vote by dictation, by phone dictation, which is practiced by New Zealand and Australia, or the ability to send a ballot electronically, encoded, obviously encrypted, where voters with visual or motoric disabilities can complete the ballot on their computer and then submit it electronically back using specific marking devices that they already have. So those are essentially additional tools that can be deployed and that are being experimented with across several US states.
Thanks, Manuel. And Secretary Wyman, I want to ask you a question from one of our audience members on a similar subject. Has absentee voting affected Indigenous communities in a unique way in Washington? And what specific voter outreach have you and your office done to work with Indigenous communities?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because very much like the adaptations we made in our systems for people living with disabilities, when we first had our committees that advised us, we thought we knew what the answers were. And when we sat down and talked to people living with disabilities, we found out that translating everything into Braille isn't going to do it. It was a very similar experience with reaching out to our 29 tribes here in Washington State. And we worked closely with our county auditors and really got them to start talking to their tribal leadership and finding out what those barriers were. So, for example, I'll use the Yakima Nation as one of those. They had a very high percentage of their tribal members who didn't have a traditional address. And a lot of that just had to do simply with the USPS not having assigned addresses out on the tribal land. So they didn't necessarily, many of their members didn't have a place that was actually their home. They were couch surfing. They didn't have a place to receive an absentee ballot or a vote by mail ballot. And so we started working through those problems. And we brought, one of the things in our new voter registration system that we brought up last year that we built into it because of these conversations was geocoding for our addresses. So now instead of having a street range in a database, we can take a geocoded pin, drop it right on where that address is, and then they're being precincted correctly, they're getting the correct ballot. And then we worked with the county auditor who put a ballot drop box right at the community center. And then the community center is a place where they can receive their mail. So we kind of solved some of those problems for some of those people on tribal land, and it's working well. And in fact, the ballot drop boxes are catching on pretty big time. It took legislation, unfortunately, to require county auditors to reach out and just ask the leadership of the various tribes to see if they wanted to have a drop box. And a few of them waited right to the last minute, but I'm proud to say that we now have a situation where 90% of our voters in our state live within 3 miles of a ballot drop box. So, or 5 miles within 5 miles of a ballot drop box. So we're getting there, and many of those are either on tribal land or very close to it.
Thank you, Secretary Wyman. And I think you and Mindy both highlighted such an important consideration is the need to work with communities, to not assume that marginalized populations will be able to vote in the ways in which those making decisions envision. And so I think that's an important lesson learned for all election administrators in the audience. So I see that there are many questions in the chat on this subject. So let's turn to integrity and trust in a mail-in voting system. And David, we'll start with you. Quite simply, how is the integrity of vote by mail protected?
Well, it's protected in many ways, just like in-person voting is, and that's why we see such almost minuscule cases of potential fraud. Washington is a great example of this. There are tracking systems that ensure that the ballots that go to voters are getting to them, and that when they come back, they're matched to the voter that they were sent to. There are multiple pieces of personal information, including a signature, that are checked against the voter file to confirm that the correct person has been voting. And then there are also additional checks in the maintenance of the statewide voter registration database that prevent anyone from returning a mail ballot and also voting a second way, either in person or with a second mail ballot. We've been doing this for a while. And a state like Washington is a great example. Secretary Wyman hasn't had to change too many rules in her state because they were well situated for the pandemic, but she has been exporting her expertise and knowledge around the United States as states have been adopting broader vote by mail options. And so we're seeing in every single state checks against the system, checks and balances to ensure that only those ballots that should be counted are counted. And then in every state, there are still options to vote in person if someone wants to vote in person, and that will be recorded as well so that the person can submit a second ballot.
Thank you, David. And I'll start with Manuel and then turn to Mindy on this one. What measures should be taken to ensure confidence in the security of each vote for the voters themselves?
Well, in terms of integrity, I'm most concerned really about the signature verification process. And I'm concerned to the degree that I think it might become the hanging chad of 2020. I'm saying this because IFES works in over 80 countries around the world, and in many countries, we've seen signature verification procedures being very, very controversial and acrimonial and leading to delays in candidate registration and various steps of the electoral process. So I'm not confident that facsimile signatures are really the best way in the long term to ensure postal ballot integrity. We have to look back at what the purpose of the signature really is. In many other countries, and I'm not sure in how many US states, voting secrecy was a concern, and the affidavit on the ballot envelope actually doesn't just state it was me who filled out that ballot and returning that ballot. It said I filled out that ballot in secrecy. And many constitutions require the ballot to be secret. So that was one of the purposes why you had signatures. Then there's countries where voting secrecy is really not a big issue, like Switzerland, where some cantons still vote by raise of hands in municipal elections. And in the US, voting secrecy is not a big concern. I know I vote in New York State as an overseas citizen, and I don't have to attest to having voted in secrecy. So if we look at what banks have been doing in order to secure transactions, establishing PINs seems to be a logical way and a much more objective and empirically verifiable way, and a way that can be verified and read by a scanner automatically, whereas I believe the best signature scanners can only really match 30 to 40% of facsimile signatures, and the rest has to be done by hand by panels of people who are not really graphology experts, even if they're trained. There is an aspect of subjectivity, especially in a polarized political environment. So I'm not sure whether signatures are going to be the future way to go to ensure that, to verify that the ballot was really completed by the person it was addressed to.
Mindy, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, you know, if we're talking about public confidence and trust, I think we're at just an absolute critical moment here when it comes to vote by mail. So, of course, across the United States, right, every state going into this election is at a different starting point in terms of how much their population has been using vote by mail. In the Western states, like Washington and California, all vote by mail or very high use of vote by mail. And that familiarity has bred a lot of trust. And in other states, not necessarily any sort of question around it, until this election. And, you know, I don't know about in Washington, but certainly here in California, we're hearing a lot of things from even the diehard regular vote by mail voters who trusted and used vote by mail on a regular basis, now wondering whether they should be using vote by mail. I think some of that is because of what's happening with the USPS. Pardon me, hopefully you can hear me. Some of that's happening because of the USPS, and some of that is certainly very much because of the rhetoric from Donald Trump and others. So I think there's this election, and then there's more broadly just making sure that the public is informed about the process. If you use vote by mail, not only how to use it properly and make sure that you actually get to cast your ballot fully, but also how do they get processed? What does that look like? Understanding on election night, certainly the delays that we expect are a good thing, that every ballot is being counted, every ballot is actually being verified. The fact that there is a possibility of a ballot being rejected, although nobody wants to see that, and there are concerns in terms of equity and how that's done, generally that's a good thing because it means that your ballot is being verified, and it ensures, right, there isn't fraud, and it ensures that everybody's ballot is being counted appropriately that should be counted. So I think, first off, just educating the public about the process itself and what to expect. And if there are doubts and concerns about the legitimacy of the process, and ensuring that there is something called a signature verification, that there are a number of procedures that are in place to, for instance, the chain of custody, right, that make sure the fact that no one, you can't vote twice, that your record, of course, is checked and verified. And you can't just, all those ballots floating out there, as we've been hearing, that are going to be mailed, those millions of ballots that are going to be floating out there, that they can't just be cast, right, by anyone. And they certainly can't be double or triple cast. So I think some of those are just the basics. And I know that as I've done my research, even in a state like California, where in the primary, we were 72% of all ballots cast were the primary in March, were vote by mail. The vast majority of the public still doesn't fully know that their ballot has to be verified, for instance, that they should be careful about signing their ballot envelope, that there is a verification process. So something as simple as that, I think we still have to do a lot more education and outreach around that. And definitely, as you mentioned a moment ago, Bailey, there is the meeting voters and populations where they're at in terms of their historical use around vote by mail, their trust around vote by mail, and using trusted messengers to convey all of that information. So we're starting at a place where people are more able to trust it and use it going forward. I think all of that's important, and I could add, but because of time, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mindy. And Secretary Wyman, I want to turn to you. As David said, you have been quite outspoken on this issue in the past few months and really leading many secretaries of states and other election administrators, through these challenges. State officials from all political backgrounds across the nations have been turning to your state for advice on how to set up a vote by mail system before the November election. So I'm curious, what advice have you been giving them to ensure the integrity of their election systems and also to bolster voter confidence that, yes, a vote by mail system works and yes, your vote will be counted?
Well, it is so much education and outreach and transparency. I think it is so imperative that you are just as transparent as you would be in a polling place where people can observe. If you can't have observers in an election shop, then you put cameras in so people can live stream it and watch it from their home. And it sounds silly, but just that fact kind of demystifies things and people realize, oh, you actually do check every signature. And getting out and explaining that, I think, is really the first piece. Second piece is voter education, is that feedback loop, particularly to those voters we've been talking about that may be young and they don't, shall we say, have a consistent signature. They have the cute, KIM with a heart over their eye, and because they're, 18 and they're right out of high school. And that was when they got their driver's license, and now they're older and more mature, and it doesn't match. How do we outreach to those voters is letting them know that their ballot has come in and they forgot to sign it, or their signature has changed, and giving them time to cure that, giving them time to get that ballot back. We do that here in Washington. And one of the pieces of it is that's also a fraud check, because I guarantee you, if Mindy receives a letter from her county clerk recorder that says your signature doesn't match and she hasn't voted yet, she's going to pick up the phone right away and call, and they'll be able to pull that ballot out and do a fraud investigation. So, educating people will also help them not make those mistakes in the future. We found that when we started sending letters to people, our rejection rates went down in terms of signatures mismatching and signatures not being on the envelope. And then same thing with late postmarks, reaching out to the voter and let them know your ballot came in 2 days late with a postmark that was a day late. We can't count it. That voter will get their ballot in on time every time in the future, because we have the data to show it. We have lower rejection rates now than we started. Another one is mailing every mailing every registered voter a ballot is another way to maintain your list. David mentioned that, and Manuel mentioned that. It keeps your list up to date, and even if the voter doesn't return their ballot, you're getting that address change from the USPS and keeping it up to date. And those are all things that go in tandem with having accurate rolls and getting the ballots to the voters in the first place. So when we started doing vote by mail elections, we were running at about 10% undeliverable rates. Now most of our counties are somewhere between 2 and 3%. So that's just over time getting those rolls much more clean and keeping that activity up. Sorry it took so long there.
May I add just one thing as well?
Yes, go ahead, Mindy.
I realize that, we're talking about vote by mail, and we're not making a lot of distinction between putting a ballot through the mail and a drop box. And that can be a really important distinction to voters. Many voters do not want to put that ballot through the mail. Again, I think it's even more challenge potentially now for some voters because of USPS, concerns. But period, in any given election, we see a good chunk of vote by mail ballots that are dropped off, depending on what is available to voters in terms of drop off options. And some voters, they want to know it goes in a box, period. And they feel like it's a black cavern, whether they have any trust, whether it's about their distrust of the USPS, period, they want to know it goes in a box. But there also has to be education around the box being secured. We just had a little bit of you might have heard across the country, some issues in California with unofficial drop boxes. We'll put that aside, but voters know that that box is, who's going to be using it, or what the chain of custody is once they put that ballot in, that it is secured, and that there's consequences, right, for any tampering. And then if I may just say something kind of fun for a moment, I think we often think about in-person as the experience that, especially our first time voting, we go and pull the lever, the old days, pull the lever. Nowadays people take selfies and that's, the communal experience. And, can we have that with vote by mail? Particularly like for young people. And my son, actually, his first voting experiences he was up at school in Washington State, was dropping off his ballot in a drop box. And he took a photo and he proudly sent it to me. And his experience wasn't pulling the lever. It was, voting by mail, right? But the drop box was his symbolic thing. I'm putting it in. I've voted. So, that sometimes can be, I think, perceived as a downside, but we also, of course, in a state like Washington that does a lot of outreach around their system, people know that they can go and do this and can maybe have some fun around it as well and make it an experience when you wouldn't think maybe dropping off in a Dropbox could be that way, but it can be. I just wanted to emphasize that too.
Thank you, Mindy. And I know that we're,
by the way, Kim, Secretary.
What was that? Where is he going?
I cherish the photo from him. It's for my firstborn's first experience voting, and it's in your state.
Makes me very happy.
So I know that we're nearing the hour. So just one final question that I'll first direct to Secretary Wyman and then David to wrap up is what are the future implications of this rapid expansion of vote by mail this cycle? And do you believe that vote by mail is here to stay and will continue to expand in future elections? Secretary Wyman, we'll start with you.
No one has asked me that question for probably 6 months, but it is the singular thing that has kept me up. Well, there's about 100 questions that have kept me up over at night. My biggest fear is that anything that doesn't go perfectly well, and we know elections by nature involve people and they make mistakes and things don't go perfectly well, is going to be, just amplified if it happens in a vote by mail environment or an expanded absentee environment. And there are many places that could happen. My biggest fear, like I said, is just being swamped and overwhelmed with volume that they can't process. And I think that the future of vote by mail really hinges on those successes or failures. And I think that if we have any kind of serious or catastrophic failure with vote by mail, that will doom it in some states. And I'm really hoping the opposite happens. I hope that people step up. I have very high confidence in my colleagues around the country that they are going to, this is going to be our finest hour. And I think if we have that big success and we see that there isn't big fraud and that people actually can vote when it's convenient for them around their schedule, and that's a good positive thing for democracy, I think this could be a real turning point. And I'm really excited and nervous all at once.
Yeah, I have to completely agree with Secretary Wyman. And I just add really briefly, a presidential election in the United States is not a single election. It is about 10,000 little elections all over the country, run under 50 different state rules. And we've got a situation where 150 million people are doing something that they don't usually do, that's unusual for them. We don't vote every day. In a system run by about 1 million volunteers all over the country. And mistakes happen, stuff happens. That's okay. It doesn't affect the overall integrity. It'd be odd if there weren't some mistakes because it's such a complex endeavor. And yet it's amazing that we've already seen 80 million ballots cast, and we've had relatively few problems. There's been a few smattering of problems here and there. People will criticize mail ballots that have some error on them. That's happened in a very small localized way, or long lines, which affects in-person voting, which happens when you've got high enthusiasm and we're in a pandemic and there's other issues that are going on. But overall, I think what's going to be the lasting legacy of this election is that voters are responding to options and choices. Vote by mail is a really important option and choice, but it's not for everybody. It can be more challenging for people who are less frequent voters, and disproportionately those people are young or people of color and people who move a lot. And so we have to have a recognition of that, offer really robust in-person options. I think we're still going to see over half of all people vote in person in this election. And I think we'll probably there's a cap on the percentage of people who will choose to vote by mail in any given election, and that's okay. But I think the key here is options, and vote by mail is a really important option to offer voters. And one of the other lasting legacies is we're seeing more and more people. Secretary Wyman, I think you're seeing this. I just looked up the statistics. Well over 80% of 2016 turnout has already returned their ballot in the state of Washington with 5 days left to go. This is unusual. As Secretary Wyman alluded, this is usually the period of time, these last 5 days, where you'd see a huge increase, but already so many of those ballots are in. Hopefully that's the lasting legacy, that voters will plan, that they'll learn about their options, and they'll get their vote in much earlier.
Well, thank you all so much. And I'm so sorry to say that we have run out of time, but what an interesting discussion. Each of you shared insightful observations, recommendations, experience. And I just want to thank our panelists again for making the time, especially during such a busy period. Secretary Wyman actively running an election. We really appreciate it. And thank you to our team behind the scenes for event logistics. To all those in attendance today, we hope you have all learned a bit more about mail-in voting in the US and are taking away some key lessons for future efforts. This panel will be available to replay on the virtual USEP 2020 website. And while there, you can also submit a question in advance for any of our panelists by scrolling down to Ask an Elections Expert. We also invite you to participate in our video and photo contest. Show us, what does democracy look like to you? For those of you interested in joining Microsoft representatives for their office hours to discuss their Defending Democracy program, which starts in the Exhibitors Hall on the USEP website in about 5 minutes, please see the chat for the link, and additional details will be provided on screen. Next week, we have a number of other panel discussions, resources on the US elections, and a make your own forecast map for election day. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we have our second youth panel tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern. Be sure to visit www.usep.ifes.org to RSVP now and engage with us virtually to continue the conversation. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.